By March 1941, Otto Kretschmer had sunk 47 Allied ships, 274,000 tons of shipping sent to the bottom. He'd been in combat for 18 months. He'd never been caught. He was 28 years old, the highest-scoring submarine commander in Germany's history, and everyone from Adolf Hitler to the Berlin newspapers treated him like an invincible force of nature. He was not invincible. He just hadn't lost yet. On March 17, 1941, British destroyers found him southeast of Iceland. They drove his submarine U-99 to 700 feet, far past its tested depth, with depth charges that shattered fuel lines and ballast tanks and compasses, and left the boat barely functional. Kretschmer surfaced what was left of his submarine, scuttled her so she couldn't be captured, and went into the water of the North Atlantic in March. The British destroyer Walker fished him out. A British sailor climbed down a cargo net, hung over the ship's side, and personally pulled him from the water because Kretschmer was too exhausted to climb on his own. He spent the next 6.5 years as a prisoner of war, first in England, then in Canada, at a former boys' school in Ontario, converted to a prison camp. He was there until December 31st, 1947, when the Allied authorities finally released him. He had survived the war. Most of his peers had not. And as the years in captivity accumulated, he learned exactly what had happened to them. Every name, every boat, every date. The story of German U-boat prisoners is, in part, the story of men who had to sit still and watch from behind barbed wire as the fleet they'd been part of was systematically destroyed. Some of them tried to escape. Some of them were secretly recorded by Allied intelligence. Some of them spent years in the Alberta prairie working on farms, eating food better than the Canadian civilians who lived next door. They were the lucky ones, though it didn't feel that way at first. What it felt like was humiliation and helplessness. What it turned out to be was survival. For most of the war, German submariners understood their possible outcomes in two categories. You came home from a patrol, or you didn't. The category came home as a prisoner was real but felt theoretical. You couldn't imagine being captured and brought back to your enemy's country because you couldn't imagine the sequence of events that would get you there. You either surfaced after a depth charge attack and survived it, or you went down in your boat. The reality was more varied than that, but the math had one fixed point. The death rate was extraordinary. Of the approximately 39,000 men who served in the German submarine force, around 28,000 died. 7 out of 10. The highest casualty rate of any branch of any military in the Second World War. More than 3 times the death rate of the German army. Higher than the kamikaze pilots. Higher than the soldiers in Stalingrad. Most of those deaths happened in submarines. A boat that went too deep, or took a torpedo, or ran out of oxygen, or was rammed, didn't often produce survivors. The Atlantic doesn't give you many chances to get away. When a pressure hull fails at 300 feet, you have seconds. When you're hit by a depth charge at full depth, the percussion alone can kill every man aboard. The boats that sank often went down with all hands and no warning, and the men's families received a telegram that said, overdue and presumed lost, because there wasn't anything more specific to say. The men who did get captured were a relatively small number. About 5,000 German naval personnel spent time as Allied prisoners of war over the course of the conflict, though exact numbers for submarine crews specifically are difficult to establish. They represented boats that surfaced and were captured intact or nearly so, like U-505, seized by an American task group in June 1944 with 58 survivors, or submarines that were depth charged to the point where the commander surfaced to save whoever he could. Kretschmer himself saved 40 men from U-99 before she sank. The first thing that happened to a captured U-boat commander in Britain was interrogation. Not torture, not the Hollywood version of interrogation. The British military intelligence operation that processed German prisoners called the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, had discovered something important early in the war. You didn't need to threaten people to get them to talk. You needed to make them comfortable. Captured submariners were taken to country houses in Buckinghamshire. Latimer House specifically handled naval intelligence, meaning U-boat crews and Luftwaffe pilots came through there in the early days after capture, held for 2 weeks before transfer to permanent camps. The prisoners were given decent food. They had rooms with furniture. They were given newspapers to follow the progress of the war. Officers held there compared it favorably to anything they'd expected. One prisoner, according to a declassified account, wrote to his family that he wished they could be there to enjoy the lifestyle. He was not being ironic. He was genuinely comfortable. He had no idea why. The entire facility was wired with hidden microphones. Every conversation, every room, every patch of garden, including in some accounts, the trees outside, was monitored. Hidden in the basement, a team of listeners, most of them German Jewish émigrés who had fled the Nazi regime and were now serving in the British Pioneer Corps, transcribed what the prisoners said to each other when they thought no one was listening. The operation produced more than 100,000 transcripts over the course of the war, though it wasn't declassified until the late 1990s, more than half a century after the fighting stopped. What the prisoners gave away wasn't always tactical intelligence, though there was plenty of that. Information about new torpedoes, about patrol areas, about technical problems the submarine service was working through. What they also gave away, talking to each other in what they believed was privacy, was what they knew about the war, what they'd seen, what they feared, how they thought it was going. A German submariner sitting in a comfortable English country house in 1942 or 1943, talking to a fellow prisoner over what he believed was an unmonitored meal, would say things he'd never say in a formal interrogation. He'd say what he actually thought about the Atlantic campaign. He'd name boats and commanders he knew were lost. He'd let slip that he'd been on 3 patrols and believed a 4th was statistically unlikely to end well. The listeners in the basement transcribed all of it. The week in March, 1941. When Otto Kretschmer was captured is worth examining in detail because it shows how quickly the character of a war can change. By early March 1941, there were 3 men who represented what a German U-boat commander could be at his absolute best. Guenther Prien had taken U-47 into Scapa Flow in October 1939 and sunk the British battleship Royal Oak at anchor in Britain's own primary naval base, then navigated out again in the dark. He'd sunk 30 Allied ships after that. His crew called him the Bull of Scapa Flow. He was one of the most famous military officers in Germany. Joachim Schepke commanded U-100 and had sunk 37 ships, totaling over 200,000 tons, decorated with every major decoration the German Navy offered. And Kretschmer, of course, was the tonnage king. All 3 were gone within 11 days. Prien and U-47 disappeared on March 8th. The full story wasn't known for years because there were no survivors. British records showed a depth charge attack by the destroyer Wolverine in the North Atlantic, which is the accepted explanation today, but Germany didn't know that in March 1941. U-47 simply didn't come back from patrol. German radio stayed silent about it for weeks. On March 17th, the same 2 British destroyers, Walker and Vannock, caught both Schepke and Kretschmer on the same night. They'd been attacking convoy HX-112. Vannock rammed U-100 in the dark. Schepke was on the conning tower when the destroyer's bow hit it. He was killed instantly. The boat sank. Then Walker found U-99 and drove it down to 700 feet with depth charges before Kretschmer surfaced what was left of it, scuttled her, and went into the water. 3 of the best submarine commanders Germany had ever produced, gone in 11 days. Germany's propaganda ministry was faced with an impossible decision. It disclosed Schepke's death and Kretschmer's capture, but said nothing about Prien for weeks, fearing the combination of all 3 losses would break something in public morale. Goebbels' diary from this period shows exactly the calculation being made. You could tell Germans that one ace was gone. You couldn't tell them all three had vanished at once. Kretschmer went to the London Cage, the British military intelligence facility at 8 Kensington Palace Gardens, for interrogation. His crew had been marched through Liverpool. The city had been heavily bombed and was deeply connected to the Atlantic War. Angry women lined the streets and threw things at the German prisoners. From Liverpool, they were taken to London, then to Grisdale Hall in the Lake District, Britain's main officers' camp, which had accumulated enough U-boat commanders that it was called U-boat Hotel by its inhabitants. In October 1942, Kretschmer was transferred to Canada. Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario, a former boys' school about 75 kilometers east of Toronto, surrounded by farmland and barbed wire and guard towers. He would be there for almost 5 years. Camp 30 was not what Kretschmer or any of the other German officers expected. The buildings were clean. There was an indoor swimming pool. There were athletic fields. The food was adequate by wartime standards. Local Canadians living near the camp believed with some bitterness that the prisoners ate better than they did under wartime rationing. The veteran guards, mostly First World War veterans too old for overseas service, ran a tight but civil operation. Think about what this represented for a man who had spent the previous 2 years in a steel tube in the North Atlantic, surfacing for 1 hour a night at 11 o'clock, breathing air that smelled of diesel and unwashed men, watching depth gauges in red emergency light. The physics of the situation were reversed entirely. Instead of a pressurized steel environment with 50 other men and no privacy and the constant threat of sudden death, there was space and air and time and information. News filtered through via Red Cross communications, letters from families, newspapers the Canadians provided. The prisoners followed the war from the inside. They knew when convoys were attacked. They knew when boats didn't come back. Each name that reached them through official or unofficial channels added to a picture of what was happening to the fleet they'd been part of. For Kretschmer, this information had a specific shape. He'd started his captivity in March 1941. By the end of that year, he'd learned about the destruction of a significant portion of the U-boat force that had been operating at the height of its effectiveness when he was captured. By the middle of 1943, the losses were so severe that even the sanitized official communiques couldn't hide what was happening. Black May alone, May of 1943, had cost the Kriegsmarine 41 submarines in 31 days. Kretschmer had been the best of them, the tonnage king, the man who never wasted a torpedo, whose motto was "one torpedo, one ship," who had personally given bottles of brandy to the captains of ships he'd just sunk and told them the nearest land. He sat behind barbed wire in Ontario and watched the fleet he'd commanded become a machine for killing its own crews. The contrast requires sitting with for a moment. 1943 in the Atlantic meant a U-boat commander had roughly a 50-50 chance of coming home from a patrol. In Bowmanville, the biggest risks were boredom and the possibility of getting caught digging a tunnel. Not everyone in Camp 30 accepted captivity as a permanent state. In October 1942, the camp became the site of what historians call the Battle of Bowmanville, a confrontation that tells you something about the character of the men held there. The British government, responding to a dispute about the treatment of German prisoners at Dieppe, ordered Canada to shackle 100 German prisoners in retaliation. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor, the camp commander, asked the senior German prisoner officer to provide 100 volunteers. The senior officer refused. Taylor asked Kretschmer. Kretschmer refused. Taylor ordered guards to shackle the prisoners by force. The prisoners had been watching. When the guards moved in, between 400 and 1,500 German officers barricaded themselves in the mess hall, arming themselves with whatever was available: hockey sticks, iron bars, baseball bats. the Canadians brought in reinforcements from a base in Kingston, armed with their own hockey sticks and ice water hoses. The resulting 6-hour battle left more than 80 Germans and 20 Canadians wounded. Nobody died. The Canadians eventually refused to follow any more British shackling orders, and the crisis gradually resolved. This is the kind of fight men have when they have too much time and too much anger, and not enough to do. It's also evidence that the officers in Camp 30 maintained their sense of identity and authority in captivity, which is important context for what came next. By late 1942, Kretschmer had begun planning an escape. Not impulsively, he was called Silent Otto for a reason. He thought it through. He identified 3 other officers whose skills and records made them valuable enough for the Kriegsmarine to risk a rescue operation. Horst Elfer, who had commanded U-93, Hans I, who had commanded U-433, and Hans Joachim Knebel-Doberitz, who had been executive officer on U-99 and also happened to be the former personal adjutant of Admiral Dönitz himself. If there was anyone who could persuade U-boat headquarters to send a submarine to the coast of Canada, it was Knebel-Doberitz. The problem was communication. Camp 30 screened all prisoner mail. Kretschmer solved this the way he solved most problems, quietly and through a side entrance. Knebel-Doberitz's wife was Dönitz's secretary. The coded messages went through her. The first letter of each word represented a dash or dot in Morse code. It looked like ordinary correspondence. Allied censors missed it. Dönitz approved the plan and assigned a submarine. What neither Kretschmer nor Dönitz knew was that the Canadian Royal Mounted Police had been screening the mail with considerably more sophistication than the Germans credited them. They'd also installed microphones in the tunnels and tracked the excavation in real time. Canadian military intelligence knew everything about Operation Kiebitz, as the Germans called it, including the submarine that had been assigned and the rendezvous location on Chaleur Bay in New Brunswick. They let the tunnels proceed. The plan was to allow the escape, let the men travel to New Brunswick, and capture the rescue submarine. The Royal Canadian Navy was desperate for a working German U-boat to study. This seemed like a chance to get one. More than 150 prisoners took turns digging, using powdered milk tins as shovels, hiding the excavated dirt in the attics above the barracks. 3 separate tunnels were started for redundancy. They worked through the night. And then, in September 1943, a section of attic floor collapsed under the weight of the accumulated dirt, and the guards found everything. Kretschmer was arrested. But another officer, Wolfgang Haider, who hadn't been part of the original group and whose name wasn't on anyone's list, had separately engineered his own escape. He'd made himself improvised climbing equipment using steel linesman's crampons, rigged a bosun's chair along the utility wires that crossed the fence, and simply rode over the top while his fellow prisoners distracted the guards. By September 24th, he was on his way across Canada. He made it. 1,400 kilometers using forged papers, posing as a civilian, traveling through a country that was very much at war. By train, through Quebec and New Brunswick, Haider crossed half of Canada in September 1943. He arrived at Chaleur Bay. He was there on the beach on the night the German submarine U-536 was supposed to surface. Consider what he must have felt waiting on a dark beach in New Brunswick. He'd broken out of a Canadian prisoner of war camp using homemade climbing equipment. He'd traveled the length of Quebec. He'd done everything right. The submarine was supposed to be there. He was going home. He had followed every instruction in Kretschmer's coded letters and reached the rendezvous point at the exact moment specified. The Royal Canadian Navy was waiting. Personnel on shore used the exact light signal Haider had been told to look for. The German submarine surfaced. It had been sent to pick up Kretschmer and the others. Its commander, finding signals that looked correct, but hydrophones picking up the sound of warships nearby, opted to stay submerged and evade rather than surface into what felt like a trap. He got away. Haider was arrested on the beach, U-536 was sunk the following month, northeast of the Azores, by 1 British and 2 Canadian warships. 38 men died. The submarine sent to rescue the prisoners at Bowmanville had escaped the trap at Chaleur Bay, only to be sunk 30 days later by a conventional anti-submarine patrol. This is the part that inverts the expected emotional logic of the story. The men in Camp 30 thought of themselves as the unlucky ones, captured, behind barbed wire, unable to fight, unable to contribute. Their war was over and they were waiting it out in a former boys' school in Ontario, while their country fought for survival. That's how it felt. Humiliating, helpless. The men still at sea thought they were the ones with something to live for. They were still in the fight. Every patrol that ended with them alive and at sea was proof the war wasn't over yet. Some of them had been in the service since the happy time of 1940 and 1941, when U-boats sank ships faster than Britain could replace them, and the math seemed to favour Germany indefinitely. What Kretschmer could see from Bowmanville, reading Red Cross mail and prisoner newspapers and the sanitised communiques that filtered through, was what the men at sea couldn't see while they were in it. The trend. Not any single sinking or any single campaign, but the direction everything was moving. In 1941, when he was captured, the Atlantic campaign was still winnable. By 1943, it wasn't. The escort carriers, the long-range aircraft, the acoustic homing torpedoes, the code breaking, all of it had combined to make the Atlantic a fundamentally different environment than the one Kretschmer had operated in. Donitz's withdrawal of wolf packs in late May 1943 after Black May's losses wasn't a temporary retreat. It was an acknowledgement that the mathematics had changed permanently. 7 out of 10. That's how many of the men Kretschmer had served with, or trained, or known by name from flotilla briefings, were going to die in submarines. Some of them already had. Some would over the next 2 years. And some of the men who'd been captured alongside him at the start of the war were, from a statistical standpoint, the luckiest members of the German submarine survey, because they'd been removed from the odds before the odds got truly catastrophic. This knowledge didn't arrive all at once. It accumulated over years. Kretschmer had time, years and years of it, to sit in Bowmanville and add names to lists. Gwenther Prien and all hands on U-47, March 8th, 1941. The same week Kretschmer was captured, Joachim Schepke killed on U-100, March 17th, 1941. The same day Kretschmer went into the water. Werner Henke, commander of U-515, one of the more successful captains of the mid-war period, who was captured in May 1944 when his boat was sunk in the Atlantic, and then shot dead by a guard at Fort Hunt prisoner of war camp in Virginia in June 1944, apparently while attempting to escape. Dead in an American prisoner of war camp 2 months before the Allied breakout from Normandy. Reinhard Hardigan, who had commanded U-123 during Operation Drumbeat in early 1942 off the American East Coast, was not at Bowmanville. He'd been invalided out of submarine service before capture was possible, a wound from the First War ending his active career. He survived. Others from that same period did not. Most of the commanders who had run drumbeat with him and sunk ships off New York and Cape Hatteras in plain sight of the shore lights were dead by 1944. The submarine U-536, sent to rescue Kretschmer and the other officers from Bowmanville, sunk in the Atlantic in October 1943 with 38 dead. Name after name after name. Camp 30 held some of the most accomplished submarine officers Germany had ever produced, and their individual stories after capture illustrate how unpredictable survival turned out to be. Horst Elfer had commanded U-93 before being captured in January 1942 in the North Atlantic. His boat had been depth-charged to the surface, and he'd scuttled her. He ended up at Bowmanville as one of the 4 original officers targeted in Operation Kiebitz. He survived the war in captivity, which means he survived it at all. U-93's next crew was less fortunate. The boat was already gone when Elf was still at Bowmanville. Hans I had commanded U-433 in the Mediterranean. He was captured in November 1942 when his boat was caught on the surface by a British destroyer and sunk. He too ended up at Bowmanville. His survival in captivity, while the Mediterranean campaign consumed boat after boat around him, is the kind of thing that defines a life by accident. Hans Joachim Knebel-Doberitz, the fourth member of the Kiebitz group, had been executive officer of U-99. His capture on the same night as Kretschmer meant he sat out the war in camps, while every other officer he might have served with kept going into an increasingly lethal Atlantic. As Dönitz's former adjutant, he would have known better than almost anyone what the casualty figures actually meant for the fleet. He survived the war. Wolfgang Hader, the man who actually made it to Chaleur Bay, didn't survive the war in the same sense. He made it out of Bowmanville. He made it across Canada. He made it to the beach at New Brunswick. He was arrested while waiting for the submarine. He was returned to captivity. After the war, according to available records, he died in August 1947. 2 years after Germany's surrender, while still in post-war German captivity under Allied control, he had escaped everything only to die in peacetime custody. He was 33 years old. And then there was Werner Henke. Henke commanded U-515 and ran a successful career in the Central Atlantic and off the South African coast before he was caught. He was depth charged to the surface in May 1944. His boat sunk, and he was taken to the United States as a high-value prisoner. At Fort Hunt in Virginia, where military intelligence processed captured German officers, something went wrong in June 1944. The official account says Henke was shot while attempting to escape. He was climbing a fence. A guard shot him. The accounts are brief, and the details aren't fully documented. Henke died at Fort Hunt 2 months before the liberation of Paris. He survived everything the Atlantic threw at him and died at a prisoner of war camp in Virginia. Kretschmer outlived all of them. He was released December 31st, 1947. He went back to Germany and eventually joined the West German Navy when it formed in 1955, rising to command the 1st Escort Squadron and eventually serving as Chief of Staff of the NATO Naval Forces Baltic approaches. He retired in 1970 with the flag rank of Rear Admiral. He made friends with Donald McIntyre, the Royal Navy captain who had commanded the destroyer that sank U-99. In 1955, McIntyre returned Kretschmer's binoculars, which he'd kept since pulling them from the sinking boat in 1941. Kretschmer died in Bavaria in August 1998 at age 86, from injuries sustained when he fell while climbing steps on a Danube cruise to celebrate his 50th wedding anniversary. He was on vacation. His ashes were scattered at sea. The German prisoners held in the United States had a similar experience to those in Canada, with some differences specific to the American context. 425,000 German prisoners of war were distributed across 700 camps in the continental United States during the war. They worked in agriculture, in orchards and canneries and mills, filling labor gaps created by the millions of American men in uniform overseas. They were paid American wages per the Geneva Convention. The standard complaint from American labor unions was that prisoner labor was undercutting union workers. Prisoners from the campaigns in North Africa, the first large batch, arriving in 1942 after the Allied victories in Tunisia, found themselves in camps across the American South and West that were in some respects more comfortable than anything they'd known in the Wehrmacht. The American Southwest in summer was brutally hot, but the facilities were adequate, and the food was what the United States could produce at its wartime agricultural peak, which was considerable. A November 1943 poll found that 74% of Americans blamed the German government rather than German soldiers for the war. The government received hundreds of letters every week protesting the good treatment of German prisoners. Many demanded the prisoners be killed. The government's position was consistent. treating prisoners according to the Geneva Convention made it more likely that Germany would treat American prisoners well in return. This argument was correct and largely prevailed, though it was never popular. For German submariners specifically, the camps represented a kind of mirror of the Atlantic campaign they'd been part of. In the Atlantic, the question was whether your specific patrol happened to encounter an escort carrier group, or a long-range Liberator bomber on the right vector, or a sonar contact that led directly to an accurate depth charge pattern. Survival was not purely about skill. Skill mattered, but luck mattered too. And in 1943 and 1944, the luck was running strongly in the other direction. In the camps, the question was whether you'd been captured early enough to miss the worst of it, and what you learned in captivity about the men who hadn't made it. The American intelligence services were less sophisticated than the British CSDIC operation, but they still processed captured German officers through facilities like Fort Hunt, where interrogators with excellent German language skills conducted detailed debriefs of everything the prisoners knew. Most Germans left the United States after the war, according to post-war accounts, with positive feelings about the country. They'd been adequately treated. They'd learned English. Many had earned several $100s in wages that were useful in post-war Germany. Some 5,000 eventually emigrated to the United States permanently. Thousands more returned to visit. One former German prisoner, cited in post-war reporting, surveyed 80 fellow prisoners he'd corresponded with after the war. None of them had required re-education upon returning to Germany, he reported, because they'd become what he called convinced Democrats, simply from being treated like human beings by the country that had captured them. That account is worth pausing on. Men who had served in the German submarine force, who had gone out to sink Allied shipping and had been sunk themselves, emerged from American captivity believing in democratic governance. Not because anyone had lectured them, because the treatment they'd received was consistent with the stated values of the country detaining them. The gap between what Germany's propaganda said about the Allies and what the Allies actually did was apparently persuasive. None of them had gone through what the men at sea went through in the last year of the war. That was the difference that mattered. The CSD-IC eavesdropping, operation at Latimer House and Wilton Park was one of the most successful intelligence gathering operations of the war, and the prisoners who provided all that intelligence never knew it was happening. The design of the operation was specifically based on human psychology. Prisoners who believed they were being interrogated would be careful. Prisoners who believed they were relaxing privately with fellow captives would say whatever they actually thought. The country houses were set up to feel like gentlemen's retreats, not prison facilities. There was billiards, there was good food, there were comfortable chairs, there were newspapers. Allied intelligence provided stool pigeons, German speakers, sometimes Jewish refugees, sometimes actual undercover officers who mingled with the prisoners and steered conversations toward topics of interest. Hidden in the basement, the listeners sat at recording equipment with blank acetate discs, cutting 7-minute segments of conversation, transcribing everything. The transcripts went to naval intelligence, army intelligence, air intelligence. By 1945, there were 50 to 90 copies of each report being distributed to more than a dozen agencies. U-boat crews were specifically valuable sources. The Latimer House Naval Intelligence Section grew from 3 officers and a civilian in December 1940 to 13 officers and more than a dozen support staff by November 1944. The captured submariners knew things that couldn't easily be found elsewhere. How the acoustic torpedoes actually worked in practice, whether the snorkel was causing as many problems as it was solving, what commanders believed about why Allied anti-submarine tactics had improved so dramatically. Few captives resisted telling each other what they knew once they believed they were private. The transcripts show men bragging to each other about how they'd put one over on their interrogators, and in the process of bragging, revealing exactly the information the interrogators most wanted. men sketching technical diagrams on paper, provided to them precisely so they'd do exactly that. Men describing specific patrol routes and submarine capabilities in the emotional release of what felt like private conversation. When the transcripts were finally declassified in the late 1990s, more than half a century had passed. Most of the men recorded were dead. The listeners in the basement, many of them German Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany and were now listening to captured Wehrmacht officers casually describe atrocities in the East, had never received public acknowledgement. The transcripts showed not only tactical intelligence, but in some cases, German officers describing the Holocaust in first-hand terms that proved what had happened and who had known about it. None of this was what the prisoners thought was happening. They thought they were having private conversations with fellow captives. The walls had ears, and the ears had transcription equipment in the basement. By mid-1944, any informed prisoner at Bowmanville or in an American camp who was paying attention could calculate what was happening to the submarine force they'd been part of. The tonnage king himself could do the math. He'd been captured in March 1941, when the U-boat fleet's monthly sinkings of Allied shipping were at their peak. By 1944, the numbers had inverted. The Allies were sinking submarines faster than Germany could build them. Every boat lost represented 50 men. Every month's losses added to the cumulative total. 7 out of 10. Donitz kept sending boats out. The boats kept going. The crews were told that new technology was coming. The Type 21 U-boat, with its large battery capacity and snorkel for underwater diesel operation, would change the equation again. It was almost true. The Type 21 was a genuinely revolutionary design. There just weren't enough of them in time, and the Allied bombing campaign against German shipyards had slowed production severely. In the camps, the prisoners followed news of all this through whatever channels were available. Some remained convinced that Germany would find a way to reverse the losses. The same confidence that had made them effective submarine commanders. The belief that skill and dedication could overcome adverse odds, now served as a kind of psychological buffer against the evidence accumulating in Red Cross, communiqué, and newspaper accounts. Some didn't bother with the buffer. They'd done the arithmetic. They knew. Kretschmer, who'd been called Silent Otto for his reluctance to broadcast radio messages that might give away his position, applied the same economy of expression to what he understood about the war from behind his fence in Ontario. He didn't say much. He organized the men in the camp. He maintained discipline. He planned the escape that never worked. He waited. He was released on December 31st, 1947. He went home to a Germany that barely existed, crossed the border of a country that had been bombed to rubble and divided into occupation zones, and began rebuilding a life. The men whose absence he'd been calculating from captivity were not there to greet him. There was no flotilla reunion, no gathering of the men who'd been at sea with him in 1940 and 41, when the U-boat campaign seemed unstoppable. Most of them were at the bottom of the North Atlantic. The boats and the crews had gone down together. What remained was a tally in a ledger that nobody in post-war Germany was eager to discuss, but which Kretschmer carried in his head in numbers he would have been able to recite from memory, having had years and years to count them from behind barbed wire. 3 out of 10 came back. He was one of them. That was, by the mathematics of the Atlantic campaign, extraordinary luck, though it didn't happen by luck. He was removed from the probability field in March 1941, before the worst of it. Captured by men who treated him according to the laws of war, sent to a country that fed him better than its own civilians, held for 6 years in a converted boys' school with a swimming pool, and finally returned. The others went to the ocean floor. The last German submarine sunk in the Atlantic was U-853 on May 6, 1945, the day before Germany surrendered. Commander Helmut Fromhoff was 24 years old. He had been in command of U-853 for 11 months. The boat was a Type 9 C-40, one of the newer long-range submarines. operating in what had become an extraordinarily dangerous theatre. By May 1945, every patrol was a gamble against odds that had been running strongly against Germany for 2 years. On May 5th, one day before he died, German naval headquarters had transmitted the ceasefire order to all submarines at sea: return to the nearest Allied port, surface with a black flag, cease all offensive operations. The war was functionally over. The documents hadn't been signed yet, but Germany's military had collapsed. Fromsdorf either didn't receive the order or didn't follow it. On May 5th, U-853 sank the American freighter Black Point off the coast of Rhode Island, the last Allied merchant ship sunk in the Atlantic War, in American coastal waters, 2 days after Germany's forces in Italy had already surrendered. American warships and aircraft responded immediately. On May 6th, they caught U-853 with depth charges and rockets off Point Judith, Rhode Island. 55 men died. Germany's formal surrender was signed the following day. Those 55 men were 1 day from the end of the war. Nobody told them. Nobody could tell them. They were submerged in the Atlantic following orders from a command structure that was in the process of ceasing to exist. Otto Kretschmer was in Bowmanville when Germany surrendered. He'd been behind barbed wire for 4 years and 2 months. He lived another 53 years. He became an admiral in a different German navy that fought in a different kind of war, and he made friends with the men who had sunk his submarine. And he went on vacation on the Danube at 86 and fell climbing some stairs. 55 men. May 6th, 1945. 1 day left.